Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah. Just start that again. Our topic tonight is establishing how someone is considered a Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah, and in particular, the question of what to do when we have inconsistent or we have conflict disputes about whether someone is considered a Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah, a person whose life is in significant danger. Previous installments of the series, we discussed the definition of danger. We discussed some of the rules established by our sages to automatic conditions that are considered yesh b'sakana danger. Tonight, we're going to discuss the question of medical opinion as well as the patient's own feelings on the matter. We're going to discuss how much weight we give to these various opinions and how to balance cases where there are differences of opinion. So the topic begins with a Mishnah. The Mishnah says, in Yoma, it says, Choleh machilinos al pi b'kim. Someone is sick, Yom Kippur, he needs to eat. Normally, eating on Yom Kippur is a serious transgression, but we can give him to eat anyway if his life is in danger. How is his life established to be in danger? Al pi b'kim, based on experts. Mishnah doesn't define what an expert is, but it says based on experts. V'im ein sham b'kim, if there are no experts, machilnosu al pi atzmo, then we let him eat al pi atzmo, his own perception that he needs to eat. The Gemara expands in great detail on these rules. So the Mishnah is giving us two basic criteria which will allow us to conclude that somebody is in danger, either the opinion of experts or his personal opinion. How do these two things relate, and what is the rationale for these things? So the Gemara explains as follows. The Gemara brings the opinion of Rabbi, which we accept. Rabbi says, if they disagree, the patient and the physician disagree. If the Choleh, the patient says, I need to eat, tzarech, and the physician says, Eino tzarech, he does not need to eat, he'll be fine. Shomin l'Choleh, we give him to eat, we listen to the Choleh, we give him to eat. Why? It brings a pasuk in Mishlei, a phrase in Mishlei, Lev Yodea Maras Nafsho, that a person's heart knows the distress of his soul, which the sages interpret to mean a person is considered, they talk today that there's an expression, you listen to your body, listen to your feelings. That's what this pasuk in Mishlei is telling us according to Chazal. A person is trusted, a person is believed to have a, maybe not 100% reliable, but at least a significant insight into his condition. And therefore, we will even override the physician. Even if the physician says he's okay, he does not need to eat. If the person says, I know what's going on, I need to eat, we will give him to eat, and we will override the physician's dismissal of his concern. We'll see. We'll have some qualifications to that later, but that's the first principle the Gemara lays down, Rabbi lays down. Then Rabbi discusses the reverse case. Rofei omer tzarech v'chol omer ein tzarech. If the physician says he needs to eat, but the patient himself says, no, I'm fine, I feel good, I'm okay, I feel strong, I don't need to eat. Shomin l'rofei. This time we listen to the physician. We don't listen to his own self-assessment. So in both cases, the halacha is lenient. In both cases, we tell him to eat, whether he thinks he does, even if the physician disagrees. If the physician thinks he does, even if he disagrees. My time, what happened to the fact that a person is considered to know his own condition? Tunvahu denakit late. We say maybe the person is seized by some kind of confusion, some kind of disorientation, and he's not really in touch with his needs. So then we follow the physician. So the bottom line is, in both cases, we are lenient. If either the physician or the patient thinks that he needs to eat, we give him to eat on Yom Kippur, despite the fact that the other camp disagrees. The Gemara goes on. The Gemara has a lengthy and intricate discussion of these rules and how they fit with the Mishnah. We're not going to go through every single step in the Talmudic discussion, but we'll pull out a few of the important rules. At one point, the Gemara says that the Gemara discusses a disagreement against the doctors. If one physician says he needs to eat, one physician says he does not need to eat. The Gemara says, of course he eats. Suffering nefashos lahakel. This is a rule we discussed earlier, that not only, as we discussed in the first installment in the series, not only is mortal danger a risk to someone's life, not only does that override most mitzvahs in the Torah, even a suffix, even a case of only a possible danger, we said even less than 50%, even a relatively small percentage, But as long as there's a concrete, real, significant danger, even if it's less than much less than 50%, we override Shabbos, we override Yom Kippur, we override most halachas in the Torah. So if physicians disagree, the Gemara says, of course he eats, safek nefashos lahakel. If we don't know, it's a doubt. It's at least a doubt. We don't know which physician is right. So it's a safek. Let it be a safek. The halacha of safek is clear, that you eat on Yom Kippur or your Machal Shabbos. You do whatever you have to do. So the Gemara says, well, let's talk about a case where there are more physicians saying he does not need to eat than those who say he does need to eat. The majority opinion, maybe not quite a consensus necessarily, but the majority opinion is that he does not need to eat. There is a minority opinion, and we polled several physicians. The minority opinion, one says he needs to eat. The majority say he does not. So the Gemara says, normally the rule is that whenever we consult experts, whenever we need an assessment of whenever we need the Gemara makes an interesting distinction. It says when it comes to witnesses, eyewitness testimony, there's a rule trei kameya, that once you have two, the minimum number is two generally, but once you have two is the same as 100. 2 against 100 is still considered split. But when it comes to umdana, when it comes to expert witness, when it comes to getting assessments of something, not eyewitness testimony, then we generally follow basar deos. We generally follow the majority opinion. So in a case in a case where there are, let's say, 3 doctors saying, 2 doctors on the sick person, or 3 doctors saying he does not need to eat, and a minority opinion, 2 doctors say that he does need to eat, you might think that you follow the majority, because in most areas of halacha, when it comes to expert testimony, when it comes to assessments, we would follow the majority opinion, even a simple majority. But here, safek nefashos, when it comes to, once again, we invoke that fundamental principle, pikuach nefesh overrides all mitzvahs in the Torah, even safek pikuach nefesh does, even when there's a doubt. So if experts disagree, even if more experts say he does not need to eat, as long as there are some experts who say that he does, you can't deny that it's a safek. You can't deny that there's a real possibility here that he has to eat, even if the majority opinion is one way. Doesn't matter. We still say safek nefashos lahakel. We still say that it's undeniable that there's a real need for him to eat, and that there may be a real need. We can't deny the possibility, and therefore, once again, the rule of safek nefashos lahakel kicks in, and we say that he eats. Finally, we have an opinion of Mar bar Rav Ashi. Mar bar Rav Ashi elaborates on the principle of lev yodea maras nafsho, that a person is assumed to have an insight into his own condition. Mar bar Rav Ashi says, if a person says he needs to eat, even if 100 people say, 100 experts, 100 people say you don't need to eat, before we said, Rav Yanai said, when it's 1 against 1, when he says yes, the doctor says no, we let him eat. Mar bar Rav Ashi says, even him against 100. There can be 100 physicians. You can have the entire faculty of the hospital, the entire medical faculty are all saying you don't need to eat. He says, I do, I know, I feel that I do. We listen to him. Lev yodea maras nafsho. A person is assumed to have a certain insight into his own condition. And these are the basic rules. These are the rules that are codified by the Shulchan Aruch, largely in the laws of Yom Kippur. That's the context of the Gemara, the Mishnah, that's talking about eating on Yom Kippur. Similar rules would apply on Shabbos, as we'll discuss soon, for Chil Shabbos, for violating Shabbos to save a life. That a person is assumed to have insight into his own condition. So if he thinks he does, we will allow him to override Yom Kippur or Shabbos. Doctors also clearly have a certain insight, and if they think you need to do it, you'll do it. When they're in conflict, either way, you will follow the lenient approach. If he thinks he needs it, he'll override the doctors. If the doctor thinks he needs it, we'll give it to him, even if he thinks he doesn't. Both are considered valid sources of assessing his condition. And when there's a conflict, we will generally be lenient. We will follow the lenient view because of the principle of safek nefashos lahakel. These halachas are brought, as I said, in Shulchan Aruch. They're basically brought. They are summarized in Yom Kippur. If the person himself thinks he needs to eat, he eats. Even if 100 doctors say he doesn't. When it's a disagreement among the physicians, he eats. When it's 1 against 1, 2 against 2, he eats as well. In a case where the Shulchan Aruch does rule that in a case where it's 2 against 1, where the patient himself does not have an opinion, one physician says yes and two say no, or the patient and one physician say no and one physician says yes, when it's a simple question of 2 against 1, when there's only one who says he needs to eat, that one is considered an outlier apparently, and we follow the two. But whenever it's even, and whenever it's a larger group, even if it's a majority, we say once there's at least two, once there's at least two saying he needs, even against 100, then even if it's 100 plus the sick person himself, once there are at least two doctors who say he needs to eat, then we give him to eat. Those are the basic rules. The Chasam Sofer, the Chasam Sofer has a set of tshuvos and other discussions of the general topic of Nemanas Harofim. There's a major dispute in halacha in general. How much weight does halacha assign to medical professionals? You have questions in Nida, let's say, and the laws of Taras and Mishpacha, different questions where the doctors might claim to have some insight into the reality of a situation. The doctors obviously are not experts in halacha, but they are experts in the reality. They are experts in, they can be experts, doctors, nurses, other types of medical professionals can certainly be knowledgeable in the physiology of the person, in the nature of the anatomical questions, different questions that can be relevant in different areas of halacha. So there's a major debate when serious isurim are on the line, like nida, where the stakes are high. In other cases, we're dealing with serious isurim. How much are we willing to rely on experts? How much? So there's a major debate in the Achronim, largely in the area of nida. And poskim have very different views about how much trust the halacha has in medical professionals. So the Chasam Sofer brings the opinion that says he discusses the opinion that halacha is not necessarily willing to cede authority to medical professionals. We don't necessarily trust their opinions in order to establish halacha. But for pikuach nefesh, we obviously do. When it comes to feeding people on Yom Kippur or being Machal Shabbos, we obviously do. So he says the unifying principle there is, he says that we do have respect for medical authority, for the medical profession, but we're not absolutely convinced that what they're saying is true. We consider it plausible, we consider it possible, but not certain. We consider what they're saying as likely, perhaps, as perhaps it's true, but we're not absolutely convinced that it's true. So once again, we go back to the cardinal rule of pikuach nefesh. When it comes to mortal danger, we say pikuach nefesh overrides all isurim of the Torah, even safek pikuach nefesh, even when there's a doubt. Therefore, he says that's why, even though Chazal were somewhat ambivalent, even our sages were not sure how much we should trust the assertions of individual physicians or the medical profession in general. At least a safek it is. It at least creates a possibility that whatever they're saying is true. So when it comes to questions of life and death, of pikuach nefesh, we will absolutely override Shabbos and Yom Kippur and most prohibitions in the Torah based on what the physicians claim. When it comes to questions of nida or other areas of halacha where it's not a pikuach nefesh issue, then we say, wait a second, we're not so sure, maybe not. We're not really sure that we accept what the doctors are telling us. There's a fascinating tshuva in the Sefer Imre Shefer. The Sefer Imre Shefer was written by Rabbi Kalatskin. Rabbi Kalatskin was one of the Gedolei Hador a century ago in Poland and later in Yerushalayim. He's not well known today, but he was an outstanding Talmud Chacham in his time, and he was a very, very fascinating character. And a very traditional Eastern European Talmud Chacham, but he was also a very intellectually curious and engaged person. And he had a very high opinion of the medical profession in general and of science. He was a big believer in progress, and he had a certain admiration and respect for the medical profession. He has a fascinating tshuva in his Sefer Imre Shefer. There was a case. This is in the late 19th century, so it was probably during the fifth cholera pandemic of the 19th century, where cholera was rampant. The authorities were desperate to stem the spread of cholera. The authorities at the time believed that cholera was spread, at least one vector of infection, was through the consumption of tainted meat that had been spoiled, that had been allowed, that didn't have refrigeration, that had been too much time had elapsed since the slaughter. So the government banned the sale of meat that was after 3 days after shechita. After 3 days post-slaughter, it could no longer be sold. This created tremendous logistical headaches for the butchers, particularly around Rosh Hashanah, because there was a huge crush of meat. It wasn't practical to shecht all right then. So if they followed the law, it would make business very difficult for the butchers. So they asked him, the question came to Rav Kalatskin, do they have to respect the laws that are meant to promote public health? Are Jews obligated to respect these laws? Sometimes you see a Shiloh in Poskim and you're honestly not sure which way he's going to come out. Sometimes you see the question and I'm like, is there really a question here? Are there really two sides to this issue? And sure enough, this is one of those cases where he sees this as entirely an open and shut case. Of course, you have to follow the law. The law is trying to save lives and promote public health. Like, what kind of question is that? So that's what he says. He says, of course, they have to follow the law. In the course of the tshuva, he has a lengthy discussion about the technical sugya, primarily from the perspective of Nida, where he discusses this question of how much authority did Halacha assign to the opinions of the medical profession, medical establishment, and he actually takes the full-throated view that Halacha does have a lot of confidence in the opinions of the medical profession. It's much debated, but he himself very much did believe, the way he understands the sugya, Chazal very much did believe that we should accept, not just as a suffix, as the Chasam Sofer said, but as other Acharonim said, but he actually believes that we should accept the conclusions of the medical profession as accept them as correct and establish halacha based on that. And he therefore says, of course, you have to follow what the medical profession is telling you, what the government is telling you. You absolutely can't endanger your customers because it's hard for you to profit otherwise. Now, there's a great irony here that modern science does not actually believe that cholera is transmitted through tainted meat. His entire tshuva, a full-throated endorsement of accepting the conclusions of science, was written in a case. One of the most pro-science, pro-medical profession tshuvas in the Achronim is actually written in a case where the medical establishment was dead wrong. Cholera is transmitted through the oral fecal route, through contaminated drinking water, if you don't have proper sanitation and the feces of an infected person get into the water. And the tainted meat might not taste good, but it's not going to give you cholera. So it's a kind of interesting historical philosophical question. On the one hand, Rav Kalatskin, who was a Gaon Olam, very much believed that we should accept the conclusions of the medical establishment. On the other hand, his case was a case where, as far as I understand, the medical establishment was spectacularly wrong. So this kind of shows you both sides of the story. Those who say we shouldn't be so quick to accept the conclusions of the medical establishment as authoritative can point to this case as saying they were completely wrong in this case, as recently as 120 years ago. On the other hand, the fundamental principles were not based on the facts of this case. The fundamental principles still are that the halacha says we know the medical profession is not always right about everything, but we have to do the best we can. These were, of course, the great debates that came up in COVID and post-COVID. The doctors, the public health people were trying to do the best they can. They didn't get everything right. They made major mistakes. At the end of the day, that's what we have. These are the best opinions that we have, and the question is, how much authority does halacha place in them? So it's a major machlokes achronim. Some achronim, like the Chasam Sofer, take the position that we treat it that we have a healthy skepticism. We treat it as a suffix. So when lives are at stake, we'll do what we need to do, but we won't. We're not actually convinced of any particular conclusion. On the other hand, the people like Rav Kalatskin had a much more confidence in the position of the medical establishment or of individual doctors. The Tur brings an interesting Ramban. The Tur says that what happens if you have one physician on one side of a question, and you have more physicians on the other side of the question, but he's greater. He is a more eminent expert than they are. So do you follow the numerical majority, or do you follow the preponderance of chachma, preponderance of expertise? So there were some who held that you follow the expertise. If one person is simply a more expert physician, a more expert greater expert in this area, you follow him, even if more physicians disagree. Ramban disagrees. The Ramban says once they're all competent, we're not talking about amateurs, once they're all trained physicians, competent physicians, the fact that one of them is more eminent, we still follow, again, if it's two against more than two, it's even. But if it's two against one, we will follow the majority, the two against one, even if the one is more eminent, because the two is still two. However, even the Ramban agrees if he is muflag, if he's outstanding, if he is a world-class person, if he's a top expert, whatever the right word is, if he's particularly eminent, then we will follow him over the two. This is a fundamental question. When we make decisions in our own lives, in our personal lives, on medical questions, obviously we all have some kind of matrix of how we weigh the numbers of doctors who take a particular position with the expertise. Obviously, one specialist counts more than 10 recently minted MDs, but and we would generally think so, even if they have technically just gotten their MDs and passed their boards or whatever. If you have one expert who's written the book on this and has been doing this for 30 years, we might be inclined to trust the expert. Or do you say that if every single MD thinks differently and then he's just an idiosyncratic fellow, maybe not? So that's what the Rishonim are talking about here. So on the one hand, we paskin, the Ramban paskins, we paskin like the Ramban, that if it is just a question, if it's a question of he's a greater expert, but they're all basically in the same league, then we paskin, you follow two against one, the majority, even if he's a greater expert. But if he's muflag, if he's outstanding, then we follow him, even if there are two, even if he's only one and there are two against him. The Chaburah adds, other Achronim add, this that we follow the muflag, the outstanding expert, even against two who disagree with him. Again, once again, that's only lahakel. That's only to be lenient. That if the outstanding expert says he needs to eat, even if two say he does not, we will give him to eat. But in the reverse case, where the muflag says he's fine, it's okay, you don't need it, but two of them who are ordinary doctors say you do, again, we'll be lenient. Once again, the same basic rules, suffering the fashus lahakel, one outstanding expert and two normal qualified physicians are considered roughly equal. So either way it goes, we'll be suffering the fashus lahakel. Whichever side of that debate is lenient, we'll follow that opinion because there's no clear preponderance of power in this case, apparently. So we'll follow we'll follow whichever one says to be lenient. There's a very important tshuva of the Radvaz. Radvaz, Rabbi David ben Zimra in the 16th century in Egypt. He was asked about a case. So in the Gemara talked about a case, Lev Yudea Maras Nafsho, a person is believed to have a somewhat reliable self-assessment. The Gemara said if a person feels he needs to eat and the physician says no, even 100 physicians say no, we let him eat, we give him to eat because Lev Yudea Maras Nafsho, he's in tune with his body and he needs to eat. The Radvaz wants to know, someone asked the Radvaz, does that apply more broadly? Forget eating on Yom Kippur. Does that apply in terms of medicine, in terms of other medical questions? The patient says, I want this, I need this. The doctor says, you don't need that. It's not for you. That's not what you need. It's not going to help. You don't need it. Does this apply in general? Can the patient say, I want this medicine. This is my problem. I self-diagnose as this. Every doctor's nightmare. The patient is convinced that he can diagnose himself correctly. He's convinced that he knows the proper therapy for his condition, and the doctor disagrees. Do we really say Lev Yudea Maras Nafsho? Will we allow him to follow his own feelings to violate Yom Kippur or Shabbos in such a case? So the Radvaz brings that it was a machlokes, that there were some poskim who said it's like the Gemara, that just like the Gemara said about eating on Yom Kippur, even if 100 physicians say he doesn't need to eat and he says he does, then he can eat. Same thing applies here. If he says, this is my condition, I need this medicine, doctors say, no, you don't, you're wrong. Lev Yudea Maras Nafsho, we listen to him. Other Chacham said, no. When it comes to eating, a person knows he feels weak, he feels like he's getting faint, he feels like he's undernourished. That's something maybe our sages are willing to trust the person's own self-assessment. But if it's a question of what medicine you need, you're not a doctor, what do you know about the nature of your illness and what medicine you need? That was the debate among various Chachamim in the time of the Radvaz. They brought this question to the Radvaz. They said we only find this idea in the Gemara of Levi Amaras Nafsho. We only find this in the context of eating. We don't find it anywhere else in Shabbos about medicines and other types of Chil Shabbos. The Gemara only said it about eating. The Radvaz sided with the lenient view that the concept of Levi Amaras Nafsho does extend to cases of other types of medical questions more broadly, is not limited to eating. The Radvaz was unhappy that he was even asked this question. He says that those who said that they weren't sure, that those who said you can't be Machal Shabbos based on a person's self-assessment, Chazal disapprove of you, he says. Chazal say that anyone who's asking questions about Pikuach Nefesh, who's dithering and pontificating about when lives are at stake is criticized. This is absolutely a suffix Pikuach Nefesh. If the person says, this is what I need, this is my condition, I need to do this, doesn't matter if the doctors disagree, we are going to listen to the Choleh. That is Lev Yodeh Maras Nafsho. So the Radvaz has this hugely important extension of the principle of Lev Yodeh Maras Nafsho. A person knows what he needs. A person has to listen to his body. It's not limited to eating. It applies to other types of therapeutic interventions as well. The Radvaz goes on at some length about this. The Radvaz finishes up by saying that this is his conclusion. This is his conclusion. He says there's one difference, he says, between food and medicine. Food, even if the doctor thinks the food is actually going to be harmful for him, if he thinks he needs it, we say levideh maras nafsho when he eats it. Medicine, it depends. If the doctor just thinks it's pointless, it won't accomplish anything, we'll still listen to the patient because levideh maras nafsho. But if the doctor thinks it's harmful, then we won't let him be Machal Shabbos to do the medicine. If the patient says, I need this medicine, doctor says it's actually bad for you, then if there's Chil Shabbos involved, we won't let him be Machal Shabbos if the doctor says it's actually harmful. But if the doctor just says it's pointless, it has no, it's useless, but it's not gonna hurt, then if the patient says I need it, we listen to the patient because Lev Yodeh Maras Nafsho. Now, taking at face value, this Radvaz sounds like quite a radical idea. That all the doctors can say the patient is ignorant, he's off the wall, he's being foolish. No, it doesn't matter. The patient says, this is what I need. We listen to him. So the later Achronim over the last century circumscribe this Radvaz. They limit what he actually saying. The Bir Halacha, the Chavetz Chaim in his Bir Halacha, he says the Radvaz is not telling us, the Radvaz does not mean to say that if we know the disease that he has strep throat, he's having a heart attack, he has COVID, whatever it is. If there's a known, well-defined disease that he has, and the standard of care, we know what works and what doesn't work, and the patient says, I want treatment X for this disease, and science doesn't believe it. I don't want to start getting too controversial. We can talk about ivermectin for COVID or for different types of things where the different types of snake oils that people might want. The patient says, I need this. And the doctors say, no, you don't. You don't need this. Then the Bir Halacha says, the Radvaz is not saying levideh maras nafsho. The Radvaz is not telling us that a person knows what medicine works for him. That's not the way it works. The Radvaz means that if there's some question about what the patient actually has, we're not sure what he has. He thinks that he has a certain disease. He thinks that he has a certain problem. We can't diagnose it. We can't pinpoint it. Then we say, look, the fact that science can't measure it, the fact that science isn't able, the medical professionals can't get a concrete diagnosis. If he says I have this problem, if he says that I have a certain condition, I feel like I have a certain problem, we listen to him because he has a direct line to his body. But if we know what he has and he just feels a certain medicine will be effective, and the medical profession says it won't, that is not what the Radvaz is talking about. We will not listen to his own opinions. He's not a doctor, and we will not listen to his own opinions on the matter. Bir Halacha actually suggests that maybe we will. He actually walks that back and says maybe we could say that if he just tries to say, I believe, I did my research and I believe this medicine works, of course we don't believe him against the doctors. But if he says, look, I know in general the medical profession has concluded that this therapy is not effective, but I know how my body works and I know that a certain therapy works for me, that he says maybe, he's not sure. He says maybe we'll listen to him because maybe a person knows that the doctors will certainly concede that different medicines will work differently for different people. What works for one won't work for another one. So maybe if the patient says, even though in general the science does not accept that this therapy is generally effective, it's not part of the standard of care, but if the patient says, I believe that this works for me, how does he know that? I don't know. How on earth would he know that unless he's done it before? I don't know. But the Bir Halacha says maybe if that's his claim is, I know that this in general hasn't been shown to be effective, but I know it works for me. Maybe he says, maybe then we'll listen to him. Bir Halacha then adds one additional point, which is not really our topic for today. It's a separate topic, but I'll just mention it briefly. He says the one time we might listen to the patient, even if he's dead wrong, even if he has no knowledge and no expertise and is just wrong, is for psychological reasons. If we believe that, if we have reason to believe that dismissing him will cause him to become agitated and upset, that itself can worsen his condition, and that itself is a reason to Machal Shabbos to be, just for even if it's a placebo, just because we don't want to get him upset. That's a major topic in halacha. That's something that's something we're not going to get into today. But the Bir Halacha mentioned such a possibility. But in general, he says the Radbaz does not mean to say that a person is a doctor and can have his own opinion on medical questions. It just means that if he believes he has a certain condition, even if science isn't observing it properly, we'll believe him. Or possibly it means that if he claims that he knows that his body will react a certain way to a medicine, which is not necessarily the standard way, maybe we believe him as well. The Shmir Shabbos Kelchasa also says, certainly he says, it's for sure, a patient is not trusted to say, this is my condition. If the physician says it's not your condition, he says, I'm having a heart attack. The physician says, no, you're not. Examining you, you are not having a heart attack. Maybe you're having heartburn, but you're not having a heart attack. So he says, we certainly do not listen to the patient. Even though the Bir Halacha said that if he says, I have a certain problem with my aver, with a certain limb, we believe him. He cannot claim that he has a certain disease that has concrete criteria, and the physician can diagnose it and can rule it out and say that's not what you have. Again, we do not believe a patient to say this is what he has if it's a concrete and well-defined question, and the physician says no, you don't. The patient is not given the authority to claim he has it. The language of the Shmir Shabbos, I saw it secondhand, but the language of the Shmir Shabbos is, even though doctors are not perfect, doctors don't get everything right, but the patient is completely ignorant. The patient certainly is not right. He's a bore. He's a complete ignoramus when it comes to diagnosing his medical condition. And therefore, again, that's not what Chazal meant when they said, Lev Yodea Maras Nafsho. When the sages said a person knows what's wrong with him, they meant he knows he has a certain weakness, but if he claims he has a certain disease which requires a certain medicine, that's certainly not something he's qualified to say. If the physician says he doesn't, we will not accept what the patient thinks. Rav Shlomo Zalman adds, though similar to the Bir Halacha, he says that Rabbi Avram Sofer Abraham reports that Rav Shlomo Zalman wrote to him, and he said, but to the extent that you can, don't just be arrogant and contemptuous and condescending to the patient and say, nice try, you don't know what you're talking about. That's not good for him. First of all, it's not. Rav Shlomo Zalman was famous for being gracious and nice. Second, it's not good for a patient to be agitated and, like the Bir Halacha says, and be told that he's wrong. To the extent that you can, he says, we should not get him upset. We should give him the impression that we're taking his feelings into account. We shouldn't be dismissive and just make him feel ignored and not heard. We should try to involve him in the process. But at the end of the day, we do not accept his diagnoses in place of the physicians. Now, there's a very interesting machlokas, a very interesting disagreement about this as well. There's a tshuva of the Chasam Sofer. The Chasam Sofer writes that he had a very interesting case. His case was that there was a woman who was a Yavama. Her husband had died. She needed to get even more chalitza for Ashkenazim, from her brother-in-law, from the brother of her deceased husband. The brother was a child, was only 6. He'd have to wait a number of years until he becomes bar mitzvah, until he grows up, before she could do chalitza. So this woman didn't want to do that. She got a note from her doctor, so to speak. She got a note from the doctor that remaining single would actually put her life in danger. A strange thing. I'm not sure what kind of diagnosis this was, but he said, I don't know if he meant mental illness, I'm not sure, but he said that being starved of, I don't know, of love, of physical intimacy, of something, being starved of marriage could actually put her life in danger. She came with a note from the doctor saying, you have to let me get married and not wait for this child because my life will be in danger if I can't get married. So there were two questions here. The question is, if that's true, if we stipulate arguendo that that's true, does that justify getting married without chalitza? And B, assuming that it does, do we trust the doctors on this? Do we trust her doctor? She got a note from a doctor saying this is my need. So the question of whether this would allow getting married without chalitza is a very interesting question, but it's not our topic tonight. The other half of the question, do we trust the doctors? So the Chasam Sofer, on the one hand, we mentioned various of his responses before, where he says that even though he's a little skeptical about whether doctors are really right, but it creates at least a suffix, he said, and a suffix is enough to Machal Shabbos, enough to set aside most Yisurim in the Torah. However, he says that's when there's at least something to go on. The person is sick. We don't know how sick. We're not sure what he needs. All those questions, he says, of trusting the doctor is where we have something. We have some kind of situation here. We're not sure how to interpret it. We trust the doctor. He says this guy, someone who looks perfectly healthy. We don't see any indication of any problem. A doctor says, I diagnose this condition. He needs X, Y, Z. But there's nothing tangible we can point to. Again, if the doctor has a stethoscope and he can listen to it, and you can listen to it, and you can feel, you can see, you can hear the problem in his chest, that might be enough. But the point is, where there's nothing that you can point to, there's no concrete evidence of any problem. The doctor claims that this is, in my opinion, there's something bad going on here. Is that enough to allow for is that even a suffix? If it's a suffix, we say suffix nefashos lakel. Is that even a suffix? Who knows? The doctor just says with no evidence, with no context, the doctor just tells us that there's a need. So the Chasam Sofer is skeptical, and he ultimately concludes that no. Ultimately concludes, he says, that without at least some kind of basis for believing something's wrong, the doctor's own opinion, not buttressed by any demonstrable facts, he says, that does not create even a suffix, that does not allow basis for Chilul Shabbos. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, again, in Mincha Shlomo, is not so happy with this. He says, first of all, he says, let's say a patient has no proof, but he says, I'm having a heart attack. I need someone to drive me to the hospital. So if you have a doctor right here who can examine him, fine, so do that. If you have a friend, my neighbor 2 houses down is a Hatzalah member, I can ask him. But if you don't have the benefit of that. You don't have that. So we don't see any obvious signs of distress, but he says, I feel like I'm having a heart attack. I want someone to drive me to the hospital. Says Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, it is pashut, he says, that's a suffix pikuach nefesh. We don't know if he's telling the truth. We have no idea. We have no evidence to support him. Doesn't matter. At least a suffix it is. He might be telling the truth. He might be right. That's enough. If we have no way of resolving the doubt, that is still considered, once again, back to the same principle, suffix nefashos lahakel. Even if there's no physical evidence to back his claim up, the mere fact that he presents his claim, that itself is a suffix, and that itself is enough to be Machal Shabbos Isser Daraisa. I think this is so pashut, he says, this is so obvious, I'm writing it down because the Chasam Sofer seems to say otherwise. The Chasam Sofer says that we don't just trust people's opinions without some kind of corroborating evidence, he says. So he says he says the Chasam Sofer doesn't mean that. The Chasam Sofer wouldn't disagree about his case of the heart attack. He says the Chasam Sofer is talking about a case that, again, what he's describing is not a known condition. A heart attack is a known condition. Unfortunately, there are lots of them every year. We know what it is. We don't know if you're having one, but a heart condition, a heart attack is something that a tangible, well-known, well-understood phenomenon. If you say you're having one, we don't know. We can't prove it. We don't have any corroborating evidence. But that's something that if you say you're having it, it's something nefashos. Chasam Sofer is talking about a case where the doctor decided that she's going to get lovesick and die or something, that the absence of marriage is going to kill her. That is not a known condition. That is not something that we know about. The doctor is making up something new. He's saying you have something unique. You have something that's not any well-defined condition. That's where the Chasam Sofer says, if we don't see some kind of distress, we're not going to simply take your word for it. But in the case of something tangible and concrete like a heart attack, or he says, let's say a woman says, I'm pregnant and I'm having a condition that can endanger my pregnancy and therefore my life. We don't know that she's pregnant, but she says she is. So pregnancy is a well-known condition, which Halacha treats very often as a life-threatening condition in various contexts, as we discussed. The fact that we don't know that she's pregnant, we don't have to ask to see her pregnancy test. We don't have to see her her physical signs of pregnancy. That's because once we're dealing with a well-known condition, that's a well-defined and well-known condition, the fact that we have no evidence of the condition, the person is trusted to say that he has it, that he has that condition, at least to the extent of making a suffix, a doubt, and allowing for a Chol Shabbos. All the Chatham Sofer means is that if the doctor is making up something new, something that there's no well-defined, well-known condition that we're talking about, he just is creating some kind of new idea. That he says, unless we see some kind of distress in the person, we're not going to we're not going to we're not going to be Machal Shabbos. And this takes us to another dispute between a famous and a very important dispute between the Chatham Sofer and other poskim. There was some of you are probably familiar with at least the contours of this discussion. Back to cholera, 19th century, one of the great scourges of humanity. Cholera, millions and millions of people killed. There were I think at least 6 different cholera pandemics in Europe and Russia in the 19th century. One of the great questions dealt with by poskim and rabbanim in the 19th century was what to do on fast days in a time of cholera. Now, again, I mentioned before the case of Rav Kalatskin, where they believed that cholera was transmitted through via tainted meat, and ironically, that was not actually the case. So there was a widespread belief in the 19th century that fasting was a major risk factor for cholera. I don't think they believed that it caused cholera, but there was a widespread belief that a person who was fasting, his defenses would be lowered, his immunity would be lowered, whatever it is. I don't know how much they understood, but there was a very widespread belief that the fasting would substantially increase your risk for cholera. As we'll see, not all Achronim accepted this conclusion. And modern science, I looked into it, my Google research to see what the answer was. I couldn't find anything too authoritative. One thing I found was a paper, a handful of contemporary epidemiologists tried studying this. They studied, the paper is titled Impact of Ramadan on Clinical and Microbiologic Parameters of Patients Seen at a Diarrheal Hospital in Urban Dhaka, Bangladesh between 1996 and 2012. Ramadan is a good case Ramadan is a good opportunity to study things like the effect of fasting on cholera because A, you're dealing with a large population that's fasting, and B, you're dealing with a third world country very often where cholera is still a big problem. So good. So they've studied this. They've tried to figure out whether fasting actually puts you at substantially increased risk for cholera. It's not clear that it does. But this was apparently a very widely held belief in the non-Jewish world, in the Jewish world, in the 19th century, and a number of poskim and stories and so on discuss this question: should people fast on fast days at a time of cholera? Now we have to distinguish, for the purpose of this discussion, between fasting on like Shavas Tammuz or Shushan or Tanis Esther or Tzom Gedalia and Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, of course, is much more stringent than all other fast days. Yom Kippur is deraisa, it's biblically mandated. Yom Kippur, the penalty is karis, excision, which is much more severe than the punishment. So the poskim were much more lenient on other fast days. But our primary concern when we're discussing the fundamental principles of Choleh sheyesh bar Sakanah, our concern is with Yom Kippur. Could someone eat on Yom Kippur if he's in a time of cholera? Now, we're not talking about someone who actually is infected with cholera. We're not talking about someone who is suffering from cholera. That there's no question. He's a Choleh sheyesh bar Sakanah and he eats. We're talking about someone who is, as far as anyone can tell, is healthy, has not contracted cholera yet, but there is a cholera epidemic. It's in the country, it's in the city. Cholera is going around, and there's a belief that if people don't eat, if healthy people don't eat, they are at substantially increased risk of contracting cholera. So the Chatham Sofer has a tshuva on this topic. The Chatham Sofer writes, he reports what he was told, he reports the opinion of the medical consensus. Dibras Rofim Mumchim, expert physicians, they say anyone who leaves his house, that phrase leaving his house is going to be critical. We'll come back to that soon. Anyone who leaves his house, aliba rekana, on an empty stomach, on a fast day, damo barosho, his blood is on his own hands. He's committing suicide when it's a time of cholera. What should we do? Should we fast on Yom Kippur? So he says that he brings a precedent for this, and he says Certainly, the halacha is even someone who is healthy should eat. It's a suffix Sakanah, suffix pikuach nefesh, even if he's currently healthy, as long as cholera is in the air, as long as cholera is spreading, even if you're healthy, you should eat on Yom Kippur. However, he says, but the way I brought the question, the physicians say that if a person leaves his house, that's where it's dangerous. If you stay home, it's not dangerous. Then, of course, the answer is stay home, he says. Daven b'yechidus. This is all the Rabbanim say this today as well. There's no heter to go to shul if that's going to make you eat. If your condition will be manageable if you stay home. This is what happens to pregnant women sometimes. If they're told if they get out of bed and run around and go to shul, they're going to have to eat. If they stay home and rest, they can make it without it. Stay home and rest. That's what all the poskim will say. You don't need to go to shul. It might not feel like Yom Kippur. You might feel more Yom Kippur dick if you go to shul and eat than if you stay home in bed and don't eat. But that's not the halacha. The halacha is if you can stay home, so stay home and don't eat. But anyway, the point is the Chasam Sofer accepted the medical consensus. He accepted again, even though we saw in some of his other tshuvas, he was somewhat skeptical about he was not convinced that the doctors were always right. But a suffix it is, as he said repeatedly, a suffix it is. It creates at least a real doubt. Therefore, if the doctors tell us that fasting endangers a person's life and increases the likelihood that he'll catch cholera, which is a virulent and deadly disease, therefore he says, yes, that justifies eating on Yom Kippur. Okay, then he talks about Shiurim and how to eat on Yom Kippur, but in principle, it justifies eating on Yom Kippur. Not everyone agreed. One of the noted dissenting views was Rabbi HaKohen of Vilna. More about him in a moment, but one of the dissenting views was Rabbi HaKohen of Vilna. The other one is a posek especially dear to my heart, was Rav Yosef Zechariah Stern, a legendary, brilliant Talmud Chacham of that time as well. They both disagreed, not because of any fundamental halachic principle, but because they felt that the opinions of the doctors in this matter were not so reliable. They said that the Sefer Reishis Bikurim, or Rabbi HaKohen, he says, I want to tell you, the Chasam Sofer is not correct, he says. We have three cases, he says. There were three Yom Kippurs where people did eat, where people did fast on Yom Kippur. The Jewish community in general did fast, and nothing happened. Nobody suffered any untoward consequences. He says, he names the 3 years. In Yom Kippur of the year Tov Kuf Tadi Beis, 1831, Tov Reish Tes, 1848, Tov Reish Chav Zayin, 1866. All of those years were Yom Kippur were during three of the great cholera pandemics of the 19th century. He says everyone fasted in our area. Nobody suffered. The only people who suffered, he says, were those who did not follow medical guidance. And he says either they ate too much and there were heavy foods before the fast day. They ate too much right after the fast day. They warn you, don't do that. Make sure to eat in moderation, the right kind of foods. But anyone who ate responsibly before or after the fast day, even if he fasted on Yom Kippur, nothing happened. So you can be lenient regarding other fast days, he says, that are rabbinic, but not on Yom Kippur. Absolutely not. And he adds parenthetically that if the government official public health doctors say you have to eat, you should listen to them. It's not clear if he really meant that or if he felt he had to write that for the censors. But in any event, he disagrees with the Chasam Sofer. He says empirical evidence has shown that the fears of the physicians are overblown, and therefore we should not listen to them. He says we can safely disregard what they say. Yosef Zechariah Stern as well, and Zechariah Yosef. He also says that the experience has shown, evidence has shown these fears are overblown, and therefore we can safely we should disregard the physicians and not eat on Yom Kippur. Once again, the same irony I pointed out in the context of Rav Klatskin's tshuva applies here as well. In all likelihood, they were correct. I don't think modern science thinks that fasting for a healthy person will substantially, my impression is that modern science does not think that fasting for a healthy person will substantially increase his risk of contracting a lethal disease like cholera. But the fact is that the medical establishment in Europe, who was pretty much a consensus, it seems, at the time, did believe it was dangerous. So that's again, a fascinating kind of historical, philosophical dilemma. Do you say that at the end of the day, we should listen to the doctors and not try to bring our own empirical evidence to disregard what they say? Or do we say, look, at the end of the day, the doctors are sometimes exaggerate the dangers, and we shouldn't so slavishly accept whatever they said. So here, this was a major machlokas. There was a Chasam Sofer took for granted that we should accept the consensus. The Reishis Bikurim and the Zecher Yosef said we should not. There's a well-known story. The story has a story. The details of the story are murky and there are many conflicting versions. There's a famous story that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, one of the leading Talmidei Chacham in Vilna, that he actually ate on Yom Kippur. He actually got up and made kiddush, and some say he paskin they should eat. Some say that he actually ate himself. That some say that he actually ate himself. Apparently, according to one version, he paskin they should eat. According to one version, he himself ate. And apparently, there's a great controversy in Vilna. Other people felt that was going way too far. Healthy people don't need to eat, and we shouldn't be doing this. Some actually say that Rabbi Cohen was the leading opponent, which seems to me very implausible because in his whole discussion, which was written much later, he mentions all those earlier years. He makes no mention of any story in Vilna or having been involved in it. So it's unclear how historical the story is or what actually happened here. But this was a major point of controversy in the 19th century. Should we wholeheartedly embrace the medical consensus and treat fasting in a time of cholera as a dangerous thing to do and a suffix pikuach nefesh, and therefore we should tell healthy people to eat? Or should we say, look, it's sometimes they exaggerate. It's not that dangerous. Empirical evidence shows people are generally fine if they fast. And this is a question that happens today a lot. Doctors will frequently tell people to eat if they're pregnant or other reasons. The doctors don't really believe in Yom Kippur. At best, they think it's a traditional custom, but it's not that important. So doctors will be very quick to tell people to eat. And the question is, how much do we defer to the doctor? This question was actually discussed by the 19th century Achronim, again, 19th and 20th century Achronim. The Tiferes Yisrael, Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz, the author of the great classic modern commentary on the Mishnah in the 19th century. The Tiferes Yisrael was, a little bit like Rav Kalatskin, was a very enthusiastic admirer in many ways of modern Victorian society. He was very much enthused about progress, about culture, about scientific advances. He was a very optimistic, a big believer in modern science and technology. But nevertheless, he was hesitant to encourage people to rely on non-Jewish physicians. He said, even though the Rishonim already said, the Shulchan Aruch Paskin, that which we said, that if a doctor says someone needs to eat on Yom Kippur, we listen to the doctor, even if it's a non-Jew. That's an explicit halacha going back to the medieval authorities. Even if the doctor is a non-Jew, we listen to the doctor. Says the Tiferes Yisrael, today, one line. Today he says, I'm not sure I'd be so quick to listen to a non-Jewish doctor. Be'enai re'isi, with my own eyes, I've seen, he says, that they've lost their credibility. Everyone who has the slightest illness, they just say you'll be in danger if you eat. Maybe they think you're doing you a favor by telling you that. But the doctors are way too quick to just say there's danger. They clearly, evidently, are not really weighing the matter carefully. They're just trigger happy with their dispensations, and therefore I'm not sure we can really trust the doctors today. Bir Halacha, the Chavetz Chaim in the Bir Halacha brings this as well. He brings it to Tiferes Yisrael. He brings this from other Achronim also, and even Jews. He says even Jewish doctors. He says many of them are suspected of being over on Divrei Torah and Mechal Shabbos. They don't fast. He says they're not religious. He says. I'm not sure how much credibility we can give to such doctors. Bir Halacha concludes, though, which I think is probably the rule that every practicing rabbi follows. He says, "Be'emes hadavar tolim v'ros eni hamores ha'enyan." At the end of the day, the Bir Halacha says, and this is probably true for many of the issues we discussed tonight. At the end of the day, we can't necessarily give rigid rules. At the end of the day, it's a judgment call. The Rav, who's ruling on a question, is going to have to use some judgment. He brings from the Mati Ephraim, or Ephraim's Dalman Margoli at this point, Hadavar Toli Barosene Hamora, Vivkiyusam, Biyunam, Benin Azep. At the end of the day, at some point, the rabbi is going to have to make a call. He's going to have to decide how credible he thinks the doctor is in a given situation. At the end of the day, if we don't know, if we can't assess it, if we can't figure it out, we're going to have to, like the Chasam Sofer said, we're going to have to fall back on the general rule that suffering the nefashos lahakil, that we can't, if there's a real doubt, we can't get to the bottom of it, then it's probably going to be then we're going to have to be makel. But if the doctor feels that, if the Rav feels, if the rabbi feels that the doctor is just is just firing from the hip, and anytime he gets a question, he just says you should eat, and it's better to eat. I personally had a doctor like that once. I personally was involved with a doctor, a lovely man who was deeply committed to his patients, was Jewish, but he was very conservative personally, and he typically thought that people should eat when they have various conditions. And he said, even though it's in Kippur, I think you should eat. It's safer. But realistically, I mean, it was pretty clear that he didn't think our case was particularly acute. He just recommends to anyone he's dealing with that they should eat. So that, Lefi Rose and Hamara, in a case like that, that's a case where you would say, look, the doctor's saying you should eat, but he clearly doesn't, he clearly should not be interpreted to mean that there is a serious, genuine pigor nefesh. He's being extra cautious, and he thinks everyone should eat, and Yom Kippur is not so important at the end of the day. So why not eat? But if a person but if the doctor says there's a real issue, I don't tell this to everyone, but in your case, I think there are exacerbating circumstances. In this case, even if it's only a suffix, again, the bottom line is even when we're dealing with a suffix, if it's a real suffix, then we're going to tell you to eat because or be machal Shabbos because the rule is because the rule is suffering nefashos lahaka. Thank you all for listening. Have a very good night. Thank you all again. I'll let people unmute here if I can figure out how to do that. And yeah, so thank you so much, and happy to take questions either by voice or in the chat or any other way.
Grossman, I put two questions in the chat.
Yes. Okay, let me see. I didn't see them.
So yeah, I asked the question about whether the analysis was affected by whether physicians are religious or whether they're Jewish, and you got to that
Okay, good.
later on because I could see that could very much affect affect your thinking.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Good. So we saw that on the one hand, the early commentaries say that we accept even non-Jewish physicians. Later commentaries are concerned that if they're too quick to be too dismissive of the halacha, then maybe we have to discount what they say. Right. But that's basically the point. But at the end of the day, it's a judgment call on the part of the rabbi is what it boils down to.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
So Adam had two questions in there.
Yeah. One of them you touched base on about seeing if halacha would permit us to negate a patient's medical decisions that's not being rational. I mean, you have that. There's quite a gray area there of someone that's not demented at all, and like it's not a good idea for them to, they're not following plan of action, and then can you have a medical team that could discuss next steps, to make the right decision if they're could be at harm, could be harming themselves.
So questions of consent and of patient autonomy are very important questions. I did not really get into them tonight. There are major questions about this, particularly with end-of-life issues and so on. If a patient refuses, first of all, there's a whole question in general in halacha about the right to refuse treatment. It's a cornerstone of modern Western medical ethics that patient autonomy is kind of at the apex of the hierarchy of values, and a person can refuse treatment, assuming he's believed to be in sound mind, able to make that decision. Like you said, the person is able to refuse treatment. It's considered like a civil rights violation to force a hunger striker to eat. Poskim, the halacha takes a diametrically opposite view. A person has no right to harm himself or kill himself. And there are actually poskim who explicitly say the halacha actually mandates force-feeding people who are trying to starve themselves to death, the opposite of what the West believes. Actually, it's some of the tshuvas that I briefly touched on tonight. It goes back to the Radvaz again. The Radvaz, I think, in the same tshuva we talked about tonight, or a couple of tshuvas, the related tshuvas, the Radvaz writes, if a person needs a certain therapy and doesn't want it, we will force it down his mouth. We will force him to do it on Shabbos or during the week. A person has no right to throw away his life. Patient autonomy is not the highest role in halacha, and therefore we'll force him to. So again, the question that you raised, of course, is an important one. That what if he's not being rational, even if he's not, full-blown dementia? What if he's overwrought and emotional and is not thinking clearly, and even though he's basically of sound mind? Yeah. So these are tricky questions, and the whole issue of patient autonomy, right, is one that's probably worth a whole talk in and of itself. So yes, that's something maybe we'll come back to another time. But yeah, okay. So that's a good important topic.
One more thing you briefly talked about, but I was wondering a little bit more about it, was basically a patient that I think essentially you're treating their anxiety, but they really don't have the physical symptoms don't match up with the condition they're thinking about. So they're trying to essentially, you know, convince you to prescribe them for something. It won't harm them, but it's really just to help calm down their nerves, more or
Right.
less.
So
Worry about that.
yeah,
Yeah.
so I was actually just working on this again, going through this again just last week for an article I was writing. There are a few primary sources on this topic that are in conflict, and that and the halacha is very unsettled in this area. There's one Gemara that says that if a pregnant woman wants a light, she's afraid that if it's dark, not that she's afraid of the dark, but that she's afraid she won't be treated she won't,
Did I
that
say? Yeah.
she's afraid
Sorry.
she's afraid that she won't be treated properly if it's dark. So you're allowed to light a candle for on Shabbos, even though objectively the Gemara says that her attendants are capable of treating her properly. But if it's going to cause her distress and anxiety, that itself justifies Chol Shabbos, even Daraisa. On the other hand, there are other rulings in other places where the post can say, let's say a person is close to death and he wants to talk to his relative again. He wants to see his close relative before he dies. You can't be Mechal Shabbos, at least not with a Daraisa, to go drive a car to bring the relatives, even though he's going to get very agitated about it. But you can't do Chil Shabbos for purely psychological reasons. Some posts can distinguish between psychological reasons that are completely unconnected to anything medical, like the relative case, as opposed to a psychological reason that's connected to his care, which maybe does justify Chil Shabbos. Well, one place this comes up a lot is there's a lot of debate. I wrote about this recently. There's a lot of debate where, let's say a woman needs to go to the hospital on Shabbos. She's giving birth. And her hospital is a half hour away. There's another hospital that's 10 minutes away. If her hospital is substantially better, then that's fine. But let's say objectively it's not better. Just she likes her doctor, she's comfortable, she's used to it, and she just wants it. She feels happier going there. Her birth plan involves a specific hospital. But the other hospital is perfectly competent, objectively. You let her drive an extra 10 minutes to take her to a farther hospital. And this is a major dispute among poskim. Some poskim say absolutely not. I mean, you can't be Mechal Shabbos just to make someone happy. If there's no objective need for it, you can't be Mechal Shabbos. Other poskim say yes, but if she's going to be agitated, if it's going to keep her calm, then you could. Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva about a husband going in the car with or a woman's mother going in the car to the delivery on Shabbos. He says you should try to tell her you'll be fine by yourself. Logically, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to know what to do anyway. You'll be absolutely fine by yourself. But if she can't accept it, if she's convinced that she needs her husband, then he can go because we don't want her to be agitated. That's likely only an issue drabanan, but there's a lot of debate about these things in the poskim. So yes, so that's also probably another topic for another a more. It deserves more of a treatment than just a couple of off-the-cuff comments now. But yeah, that's also a fascinating area of halacha. To what extent will we allow full-blown Shabbos violations for a purely placebo effect, for a purely psychological effect where it doesn't have actual benefits to the. I'm actually probably going to touch on this in one of my talks on Shabbos a little bit also, not primarily about this, but yeah, so if anyone who's going to that can stay tuned. I'll probably touch on this a little bit there also. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Thanks for
Thank
the
you.
organizing work as always.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to switch off the recording. And again, I'm happy to take more questions